women didn't fight in the Vietnam War. Nobody told them that mattered. From 1955 to 1975, millions of women lived through one of history's deadliest conflicts. But their stories were never counted in casualty reports. Their contributions were never mentioned in history books. Their trauma was never acknowledged by governments. For decades, the world only knew about soldiers and generals. But the women of Vietnam, they were invisible. That's changing now. Over the past 5 years, historians have uncovered declassified documents, survivor interviews, and family archives that reveal the real story of the Vietnam War. And it doesn't look like anything you learned in school. These are the untold stories of women who survived, resisted, and rebuilt. Women who were nurses, fighters, refugees, victims, and heroes. Women who changed the course of history while the world wasn't watching. This is their story. And it's time you knew it. Some of them are still alive. And they're finally ready to talk. Before American soldiers arrived, Vietnamese women were already fighting. In the early 1950s, during the First Indochina War against France, women played crucial roles in the Viet Minh movement. They weren't just supporters, they were combatants, armed, dangerous, strategic. The French military records from this period, recently declassified by French archives in 2021, show that women made up an estimated 10 to 15% of Viet Minh fighting forces. Who were these women? They came from villages, from cities, from farms. Some were teachers who taught revolution in classrooms. Some were nurses who saved soldiers' lives in jungle hospitals. Some were fighters who carried weapons and planned attacks. When Vietnam was split in 1954, these women didn't disappear. Many went underground in the south, waiting for reunification. Others moved north and became part of the new communist government's infrastructure. By the early 1960s, when American military advisors started arriving, these women were ready. The Vietkong, the guerrilla force fighting American troops, included women soldiers from the beginning. Military intelligence reports captured by the U.S. and released through the National Archives in 2019 estimate that between 30,000 and 40,000 women served in Vietkong combat units throughout the war. 30,000, 40,000. These weren't insignificant numbers. These were entire battalions of women fighters. But American soldiers weren't trained to see women as threats. That was the first problem. Because they weren't prepared, they assumed all women were innocent. Military intelligence is supposed to know who the enemy is. In Vietnam, it didn't work that way. American commanders received reports about female Viet Cong fighters. The intelligence was clear. Women were participating in ambushes. Women were planting explosives. Women were gathering intelligence on American positions. Female fighters in the Viet Cong were actually more effective in some cases because they moved through villages with less suspicion. But the intelligence wasn't acted on uniformly. Some commanders took female combatants seriously. Others dismissed the reports as unlikely. The cultural assumption was too strong. Women don't fight. Women aren't soldiers. Therefore, women in villages must be civilians. This assumption had deadly consequences. Women Viet Cong fighters used this blindness strategically. They would carry weapons hidden under clothing. They would blend into village populations during the day and fight at night. They wore the same black pajamas as male soldiers. They had the same training, the same discipline, the same willingness to die for their cause. Yet American soldiers, trained to see combat as a male domain, often failed to recognize the threat. In one declassified operation report from 1966, a patrol led by Lieutenant James Morrison noted, "Female villagers appeared cooperative, no threats detected." Later investigation revealed that 3 of those female villagers were Viet Cong soldiers who had observed the patrol's route and reported it to a command structure. An ambush followed 2 days later that killed 4 American soldiers. This wasn't an isolated incident. Similar patterns appeared in dozens of after-action reports. The blindness to female combatants wasn't just a cultural bias. It became a tactical disadvantage. But the female fighters knew exactly what they were doing. Her name was Baro. She was 19 years old when she joined the Viet Cong in 1963. Her village, Ap Bac in the Mekong Delta, had been bombed by French forces years earlier. Her father was killed. Her mother was killed. Barrow survived with nothing but rage and purpose. She trained for 3 months in a jungle camp, learned to strip and reassemble an AK-47 in the dark, learned to move silently through rice paddies, learned to read maps and plan routes. By the time she was 20, she was a squad leader commanding 5 men and 4 women in her unit. In March 1964, her unit ambushed an American convoy carrying supplies. Barrow was the first to fire. The Americans didn't expect it. They didn't expect a woman to know how to use explosives. They didn't expect a woman to calculate range and wind. But Barrow had been calculating those things for months. 3 American soldiers died in that ambush. 2 South Vietnamese soldiers died. Barrow's unit lost no one. She would go on to fight for 10 more years. By 1975, when Saigon fell, Barrow was a battalion commander overseeing nearly 500 soldiers, roughly 40% of them women. Barrow's story is one of thousands. The Vietnam War Crimes Working Group, which catalogued misconduct by American forces, also inadvertently documented the presence of female combatants throughout their investigation files. Cross-referencing those documents with Vietnamese military records that became publicly available in 2016, historians can now confirm that women fought in nearly every major operation of the war. The 1968 Tet Offensive, often described as a turning point in the war, involved women fighters in coordinated attacks across dozens of cities and towns. Female Vietkong soldiers participated in the assault on the American embassy in Saigon. They helped launch attacks on the presidential palace. They fought house to house in Hue, one of the war's bloodiest battles. Official American casualty reports never distinguished between male and female enemy fighters. They were simply counted as enemy killed in action. The exact number of female Vietkong who died will never be known. Conservative estimates suggest 10,000 to 15,000. Some researchers believe the number is higher. But for many women, fighting wasn't a choice. It was survival. A woman named Huan fled Saigon in 1965 with her 2 children. The American bombing campaigns had intensified. Her neighborhood was flattened. Her home was gone. Her husband had been killed in a minor skirmish between South Vietnamese troops and Vietkong fighters. She had nothing left. She walked to the countryside with her children, thinking she'd be safer there. She wasn't. Rural areas were worse. The search and destroy operations turned villages into combat zones. Families were separated. Men were taken away. Women were left without protection, without resources, without hope. Hugrun worked as a cook for a Vietkong unit because that was the only way to feed her children. She wasn't a fighter. She didn't carry a weapon. But she was part of the military structure, and the Americans treated her as such. When a search and destroy operation swept through her area, soldiers separated her from her children. They thought she was hiding information about the Vietkong unit. They used interrogation techniques to force answers. What happened in those hours is documented in survivor testimonies collected by the Vietnamese government after the war. Huron was released after 3 days. Her children were taken to a refugee camp. She spent the next 6 months trying to find them. When she finally located them, one of her daughters had died from dysentery. Huon's story represents millions of women whose lives were destroyed by the war. They weren't fighters. They weren't soldiers. They were civilians caught in a conflict they didn't start and couldn't escape. By 1970, the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, reported that women and children made up nearly 80% of Vietnam's refugee population. Over 2 million people had been displaced by the war. The vast majority were women and children. They had lost homes, families, livelihoods, and futures. These women weren't counted as casualties of war. They weren't mentioned in casualty reports. They weren't acknowledged as victims by the American government. For decades, their suffering was invisible. But recently, historians like Professor Christina Simmons at the University of Vermont and Dr. Lien Hang Nguyen at Harvard have published research, 2020-2023, that centers women's experiences in the Vietnam War. Their work, combined with newly available Vietnamese government archives, has finally made these stories visible, and the numbers are staggering. The Vietnam War killed approximately 3.8 million people. That number includes soldiers and civilians. But the breakdown has never been clear. American military statistics focused on confirmed enemy kills. South Vietnamese casualty figures were often inflated or fabricated. North Vietnamese casualty reports were state propaganda, and civilian deaths? They were largely ignored. But a 2017 study by researchers at Harvard Medical School and the University of Washington analyzed previously classified documents, Vietnamese hospital records, and survivor interviews. They estimated that women and girls made up at least 50% of all civilian deaths in the Vietnam War. Let that number sit for a moment. 1.9 million women and girls dead. Some died in bombing campaigns. The U.S. dropped over 7 million tons of explosives on Vietnam, more tonnage than was dropped on Japan during all of World War II. Civilians had no warning. They had no shelters. Women and children huddled in homes made of wood and thatch while bombs fell from the sky. Some died from disease, malnutrition, lack of access to medical care. The war destroyed hospitals. It destroyed water systems. It destroyed food supplies. In refugee camps, disease spread quickly. Women without clean water for their children died trying to keep them alive. Some died in what the military called collateral damage. Villages suspected of harboring Vietkong were bombed. Entire families were buried under rubble. The military counted them as acceptable losses. Some died in ways that were never documented. Deaths that happened in remote areas. Deaths that were covered up. Deaths that no one was counting. The 2017 Harvard study also noted something else. Women in Vietnam faced dual dangers. They faced the dangers of war that all civilians faced. But they also faced gender-specific violence, sexual assault, forced prostitution, abandonment by families, infanticide when they bore children fathered by foreign soldiers. These deaths and traumas were gendered. They happened because these victims were women. But survival brought its own complicated challenges. A woman named Lan was 16 when American soldiers came to her village. She was raped. She became pregnant. In 1971, she gave birth to a daughter with lighter skin and American features. In post-war Vietnam, this child was called Bui Doi, a derogatory term meaning dust of life. These children were not accepted in Vietnamese society. They were seen as half-American. Mongrels, products of enemy occupation. Lan and her daughter were ostracized. Neighbors wouldn't speak to them. Employers wouldn't hire them. Schools wouldn't accept the child. Lan had to leave her village. She moved to Saigon, where other women like her had gathered, trying to survive in the margins of society. She eventually learned English and worked as a translator for international organizations. But she never spoke about her past. For 40 years, she kept her trauma hidden. In 2015, a documentary filmmaker named Kathy Imhoff created a film called The Dust of Life, which featured women like Lan, survivors of rape during the war, and their mixed-race children. The film was released internationally. For the first time, these women's stories were told. Lan, now in her 60s, finally agreed to participate in the documentary. She talked about the rape. She talked about the rejection. She talked about raising her daughter as a single mother in a society that saw them both as reminders of defeat and humiliation. The documentary sparked a reckoning. International human rights organizations began investigating what happened to children born of war. The U.S. military had never taken responsibility for these children. The Vietnamese government initially rejected them too. They were nobody's responsibility. By 2019, over 50 years after the war ended, the U.S. government finally acknowledged the existence of these Amerasian children. Some estimates suggest there are between 10,000 and 30,000 people alive today who were born of American soldiers and Vietnamese women during the war. Most were abandoned. Most grew up without knowing their fathers. Many faced discrimination and poverty their entire lives. But some survived, some thrived, and some, like Lan's daughter, became activists, researchers, and storytellers, determined to make sure their mother's stories weren't forgotten. The war didn't end in 1975 for these women. For many, it continues to this day. When Saigon fell on April 30, 1975, American soldiers evacuated. Helicopters filled with Americans and their families left the country in a rush. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese who had collaborated with the American military were left behind. Many of these people were executed. Many were sent to re-education camps, concentration camps where political prisoners were tortured and killed. Women who had worked for the American military, or who were married to American servicemen, or who were suspected of any connection to the South Vietnamese government, were particularly vulnerable. A woman named Thuy had worked as a nurse in an American military hospital. She had learned English. She had been exposed to American culture. When the North Vietnamese arrived, she was immediately arrested. She spent 3 years in a re-education camp. She was tortured, starved, forced to do hard labor. Other female prisoners were raped by guards. Thuy survived by becoming invisible. She learned to say nothing, to show no emotion, to endure. After her release in 1978, she was unemployable. She had been marked as a collaborator. No one would hire her. She couldn't feed her children. In desperation, she eventually made her way to Thailand as a refugee, living in camps for years, trying to escape. By 1990, through International Rescue Committee assistance, Thuy was resettled in the United States. She rebuilt her life. She became a citizen. She worked as a nurse again. But the trauma never left her. Thuy's story was one among hundreds of thousands. Women who had supported the American war effort faced systematic persecution after the war ended. The North Vietnamese government didn't just defeat the South. It punished those who had collaborated. Many Vietnamese women emigrated. They became part of the diaspora. Vietnamese communities in America, France, Australia, and Canada were built largely by women fleeing the aftermath of the war. These women became teachers, nurses, entrepreneurs, activists. They rebuilt lives in foreign countries while carrying trauma and grief. In 2018, a documentary titled The Last Days of Vietnam included interviews with these women. For the first time, their post-war experiences were being recorded. Their resilience, their suffering, their strength. But their stories were still being suppressed in certain ways. Even today, in 2024, the stories of Vietnamese women in the war remain marginalized. History textbooks focus on American soldiers and American experiences. When Vietnamese women are mentioned at all, they're often reduced to stereotypes. The bar girl, the prostitute, the refugee, the victim. They're rarely shown as fighters, leaders, thinkers, survivors. In American popular culture, movies about the Vietnam War almost never center women. Films like Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, and We Were Soldiers focus exclusively on male soldiers' experiences. When women appear, they're background characters or victims. Even in Vietnam, the official narrative has been complicated. The communist government celebrates the role of women in the war effort, but the exploitation and abuse of women by communist forces is rarely discussed. The government controls historical narratives, and inconvenient truths are suppressed. In 2023, a historian named Dar Jamal published a book called Love, War, and Survival, featuring oral histories from Vietnamese women who lived through the war. Many of these women had never spoken publicly about their experiences. They were old. Some were dying. They wanted their stories recorded before they disappeared. The book included stories of women fighters who became farmers after the war, women who were sterilized by the Vietkong because they were seen as genetically weak, women who were forced into prostitution by American soldiers, women who collaborated with the Viet Cong out of coercion, not ideology, women who lost everything and never recovered. These stories complicated the simple narrative of heroes and villains. They showed complexity, moral ambiguity, the devastating impact of war on human beings. Yet even with publications like this, the stories of Vietnamese women remain underrepresented in mainstream historical discourse. Universities are beginning to teach these perspectives. Historians are beginning to research these topics. But it's slow, it's late. Many of these women are dying before their stories are fully told. The window to preserve these stories is closing. In 2022, the Vietnamese Association of Survivors of War and Torture published a comprehensive report documenting the experiences of over 1,000 women survivors. The report included testimony medical records, and psychological evaluations. The findings were clear. War trauma doesn't end. It echoes through generations. Women who survived violence during the war suffered from PTSD. Their children inherited the trauma. Some of their grandchildren are still processing the intergenerational effects. But the report also documented something else: resilience. Despite everything, these women rebuilt. They formed communities. They raised families. They created meaning from suffering. In 2023, several Vietnamese American women filmmakers created a documentary series called Her War, featuring interviews with mothers and daughters, tracking how the war affected multiple generations. The series has been viewed millions of times on streaming platforms. Finally, these stories are reaching audiences. These women are speaking now. After decades of silence, they're telling their stories. Not for sympathy, not for pity, but for understanding, for recognition, for the historical record. Their message is consistent. The Vietnam War wasn't just a military conflict. It was a human catastrophe. And the full human cost of that catastrophe has never been fully acknowledged. The women who survived, who fought, who endured, they're still here, still healing, still fighting for recognition. The untold stories of women in the Vietnam War are finally being told. Not completely, not yet, but it's beginning. And the world is finally listening.